Hi, so this video is all about abiotic and biotic factors. Before you start, you should have completed your biotic factors self-study task. Okay, so this is really now a follow-up to that. So we're going to ask you to apply your abiotic factors to familiar and unfamiliar contexts. Then we're going to explore the biotic factors a little bit more, and then I'm going to challenge you to use your new knowledge to explain the distribution of plant species across a sand dune. Okay, so let's get going. Start off by challenging you to identify abiotic factors or how they're different in some unfamiliar contexts. Okay, so a bit of a quiz to start. Which do you think would have the highest dissolved oxygen concentration? Would it be A, the slow flowing water, or would it be B, the fast flowing water? What do you think? Well, if you thought B, you were right. Okay, so one of the things about water systems that students need to know is that if they are faster flowing, because the oxygen available to fish and other aerobic organisms in the water is dissolved oxygen gas that mixes with the water. The more mixing of the water with the oxygen in the air through fast flow, the more oxygen is dissolved and available for organisms within the water. Okay, next one. Which site do you think would have the most stable water temperature? So you've got a choice between A, which is in a river and always submerged, and B, on the marsh itself. So sometimes submerged, sometimes not. What do you think? Well, it would be much more stable in the water, and we know this because of what we know about the specific heat capacity, high specific heat capacity of water. It takes a lot of energy to change water's temperature. Therefore, aquatic organisms live in quite temperature stable environments because they are living within water. Okay, next one. Same scenario. So remember, this is a river, which is fresh water, and it is flowing into the sea. Okay, so which site would have the highest salinity? So salinity is a measure of how salty something is. So which one would you think it would be, in the river or the lower marsh? It is the lower marsh. Now that can be really important because on the lower marsh you will only find specifically adapted plants that can grow and are tolerant in salty soils. Okay, so they all have mechanisms that allow them to get rid of salts. So you won't find sort of the same plants present in the river as you would on the salt marsh itself. Okay, to the sand dune. Which do you think with a greater water availability in the soil? Would it be A or B? Now you have to be careful here because when we talk about water availability for the plant's roots, we're talking about fresh water. Okay, so have a look at where that water table is. But also think about what you learnt when you were a kid and you got yourself digging on the beach and made yourself a sandcastle with a moat around the outside. And I don't know about you, but I remember with my little bucket having to go back and forth to that sea, filling up my moat repeatedly until I gave up because the water kept draining away. Compare that to woodland like you've got at site B, and if you've had made mud pies or splashed in puddles, you might be able to say something about the water in the soil. Okay, I gave you loads of clues, so if you've not got this right, let's think. So B has got the better water availability in the soil, and the reason for that is A is basically bare sand. Water drains right through it. Okay, so although we're near the sea, that doesn't matter. When it rains, that's where the water for the plant comes, and unfortunately that water just drains straight through the sand and is carried away. Whereas in the woodland, the root systems of the other plant species, the sort of broken down material from the established woodland adds sort of structure to the soil that retains the water. So which one would you think has got the highest wind speed? Again, if you've ever visited the beach, particularly Blackpool, you will definitely know the answer to this one. So wind speed is highest on the Bur Sound, yeah. So you've got a constant breeze at the shore, haven't we? But also you've not got anything to prevent your exposure on those days where we have got very high winds. Whereas in the woodland, you've got other species of tree and plant to break the wind and to provide shelter. Which site would you expect the most mineral ions? Now I gave you a clue to this earlier. So have a think. It's worth pointing out now, whenever I do this quiz, and I have done this quiz for a number of years, most students get most of the answers wrong. So if you're getting a few wrong, please don't worry. This one you shouldn't get wrong. Okay, it should be B, because I told you earlier, you know, we've got an established woodland. There'll be leaves and bits of dead plant and rotting and decaying in the soil. And from your GCSE nitrogen knowledge, nitrogen cycle knowledge, you should know that that would return the mineral ions to the soil. Whereas you haven't really got a great deal growing on the Bur Sound, that's why it's Bur, so there's not really anything recycling nutrients and creating mineral ions in the soil. Okay, next one. Which would have the highest soil oxygen concentration? Now, soil gets its oxygen from the air as well, so it has to diffuse from the air into the spaces between the soil particles. So which do you think would have better oxygen concentration? Well, it's actually the non-waterlogged soil. So having water as a layer on top of the soil actually increases the distance, if you like, for the movement, diffusion of oxygen from the air to the soil itself. So that prevents oxygen getting to the soil, and obviously between the soil particles that space is filled by water. Okay, so there are only very, very specialist plants that can grow in waterlogged soil. Rice is one of them, which explains a paddy field. So rice is able to, its root system is able to keep respiring anaerobically in those waterlogged soil conditions that it lives. So there are, of course, these adapted plants that can live in these harsh abiotic conditions, but the majority of plants need oxygen for their root system and absorb that oxygen from the surrounding soil. Okay, and they need that obviously for respiration. Okay, so next one. Now to the rocky shore. I do like a rocky shore. Okay, so which site would the temperature be most stable? Now be careful, because of course a shore is submerged twice a day. But the further up the shore you are, the less time you spend submerged, and that makes for very different abiotic conditions. So what do you think? It's the lower shore. Now that's because submerged by water for most of the time, water being that stable environment, so it's a much more stable, sort of not as many fluctuations in the day. Up on the upper shore, you are subject to whatever changes in earth temperature take place. If the sun comes out, suddenly the temperature will rise, and then occasionally, twice a day, you get submerged as well. So very much more fluctuating temperature for you on the upper shore. Okay, what about being submerged? Oh, I might have given this one away completely. Which site would be submerged for longer? Of course, it's the lower shore. I kind of gave that one away. Okay, now we've got two types of rocky shore now. One is exposed, which means it's kind of out to sea, sort of on an outland bit, yeah. Whereas the sheltered shore will be sort of tucked away, more in a more sheltered area. I could draw that on the board a bit better. Here we go. I'll go for this. So I obviously haven't got the words for it. So this rocky shore here, this exposed one, will be on a bit of land that goes out into the sea, you know, somewhere like that, right exposed. Whereas this sheltered shore, might be in a little crop like that. Okay, so which of them do you think would have the greatest wind action and the greatest wave action? It's kind of indicated by how much seaweed. So the exposed rocky shore has got the more extreme abiotics, high wind speeds, great wave action, whereas the sheltered shore, as you can see from the abundance of seaweed, it's, you know, quite a less harsh abiotic environment. Okay, now this is one that you need to think about a little. Which would have the highest light intensity under the canopy? So this is underneath the tree canopy, we're asking. The young forest, young woodland, or the mature woodland. If you look to the forest floor, it's a bit of a clue. Okay, which do you think? It's the young woodland that has the highest light intensity. Can you see on the forest floor how there are plants growing? Whereas the mature woodland, there's nothing really, only specially adapted shade tolerant plants are able to grow. And that's because the mature woodland's got a much more dense canopy. So less light is available to those plants underneath the canopy. And as we'll look at next topic, during photosynthesis, plants absorb red and blue lights predominantly. Some of these shade tolerant plants that you find in these mature woodlands growing below the canopy have special adaptations, so they can absorb the other wavelengths of light that the tree leaves aren't absorbing, so they can still carry on photosynthesis even though there isn't a great deal of red or blue light passing through the canopy to the woodland floor. Okay, now our aspect comes back here. See whether you can remember which side would have the lowest temperature, south or north facing. So you get a difference actually in the size of leaves and the amount of photosynthesis on either side of a tree because of this. Okay, so north facing would have the lowest temperature. So that's one of the factors that affects photosynthesis rate, isn't it? Temperature. So if you've got a slow temperature, we've got slower enzyme activity, and as a consequence, we'll have a slower rate of photosynthesis. On the south side, not only will we have a high temperature, but a higher light intensity as well. So that will be both factors that increase photosynthesis rate on that south side. Now this is another quirky one to think about. Which site would be most humid? So B is kind of just out in the air, and A has got quite a lot of, quite near to the hedge, quite a lot of overlap of different plant species. Which area do you think would be most humid? So remember, transpiration is happening from the plants all the time. So I'm hoping you've picked near the hedge. So you'd have water loss from the leaves, but then it would be trapped by other leaves in that hedge. So it'd be a bit more moist than the open air. Okay, so that was a quick sort of quiz review of your abiotics. Now we're moving on to biotic factors. The first biotic factor I'm going to have a look at is competition. So we remember we've got different kinds of competition. Okay, so we've got competition between individuals of the same species. So like illustrated here, we've got barnacles competing with barnacles. So what type of competition was that? I'm hoping you're thinking interspecific competition, so between individuals of the same species. Okay, what about this example below then? So barnacles and mussels competing for the same food source. What type of competition would that be? That would be interspecific competition, so between individuals of two different species. Okay, so competition occurs between plants and animals within ecosystems, and you do need to recognise what resources they are competing for. So if you think back to plants from your GCSE knowledge, what kind of factors do they, or what kind of resources do they compete for? Okay, so obviously they photosynthesize, so light is going to be a big deal. That's always a really important factor to think about if you're trying to understand the distribution of a plant species. Okay, they will also be competing for mineral ions in the soil and water. Okay, so those factors there you might want to consider. At GCSE you would have talked about space as well, but try to stick to factors that you can link to biological processes and a need for them in the plant. Okay, for animals then, most of the time we're talking about competition for food sources. Okay, so that's the majority of our questions. The next factor I want to think about is predation. Okay, so yeah, I know that you're really familiar with predation, and I know that everybody's got from their GCSE knowledge, they remember the sort of pattern of predator-prey relationship in data sets that we would expect when prey numbers to go up in their population because they are the food source for the predator, that the predator's numbers then start to rise. As the predators are eating more prey, because there's more of them, that will bring the prey numbers down. And then as a result of there being less food, the predator numbers will go up. So we know there is a very close relationship between the population size of a predator and its prey. And you're really, really good at recognising that in data sets already. But what we're not so good at when we move to A level is recognising unfamiliar examples. Okay, so for example, like this a rocky shore example. So here we've got a crab that eats a dog whelk, that eats a barnacle. So these might be species we're not that familiar with. So it's a good idea to do a little bit of review of a bit of reading, or when you meet a new species in your exam questions, if you haven't met it before, a bit of Googling, just find out what it is, how it lives, what it eats, and that helps you with the context of your questions and build your background knowledge to ensure that you can do data handling for lots of different, making more and more habitats familiar, more and more species familiar for yourself. Okay. Other relationships. So there are symbiotic relationships between species, and there are also parasitic relationships. One that we have to be really careful with, so I'll tick off my parasite here. So we've got a nice worm, so we might have a parasitic relationship between two species where one species inhabits the other, or it lives on the other and takes only benefit for itself. Okay, so that's a type of relationship that we would say is a biotic factor. You know that we've got, for example, we have friendly bacteria inside our gut, and they show a symbiotic relationship with us, although so this type of relationship is mutualistic, so we give them nutrients, and in return they process vitamins and release vitamins for us. So it's a two-way relationship, so we're living in close contact and it's a two-way relationship. Usually people are okay with those, and that's fine. Okay, the ones that sometimes people misunderstand are the top two. Okay, so I've got two examples there of organisms eating other organisms, but the relationships are not predators. So our kangaroo is a herbivore. So the relationship it has with the grass is it eats it, it's its food source, but it is a grazer. Okay, so it's grazing. So you still know that the distribution of kangaroos would affect the distribution of this grass species, because the more kangaroos, there'd be less of that grass species because it's been eaten. Okay, but we're very careful not to refer to the kangaroo as a predator of the grass, because it isn't. Okay. On the other picture, we've got a barnacle. The barnacle's a filter feeder, so it's actually filtering particles from the water So that's another type of feeding relationship that isn't a predator-prey relationship. So it's just making sure that you know that there are some other feeding relationships that are not just, so they're not all just predators. So now we're familiar with the different kinds of biotic factors, we need to be able to apply them. Quite often we're interpreting data sets which are AO3 practicals that we've maybe never seen anything like before, and maybe even ecosystems and organisms that we're not familiar with. And yet we've got to apply our knowledge of biotic factors and how they impact the distribution and abundance of species in a habitat. So I'm going to model an example here, which is from the rocky seashore. Okay, so we've got starfish, which is a predator at the seashore, and then we've got the two species that it predates. So we've got barnacles and mussels. So the starfish eats the barnacles and the mussels. And we've got barnacles and mussels, they both eat the same food source, so they're competitors for their food. So in this experiment, the scientists went to the rocky shore and they went around with a bucket and they removed all of the starfish from that rocky shore. Okay, and they had obviously measured the population sizes of the barnacles and the mussels before the start of the experiment, and then they measured the population sizes of the barnacles and the mussels for a time period repeatedly over a few weeks once the starfish had been removed. And what they found was surprising. They found that when you remove the starfish from the rocky shore, the numbers of the mussels went up. Maybe not surprising, you've removed their predator. But at the same time, the barnacle numbers declined until there were no barnacles on the shore. So my question to you now is, can you use your knowledge of biotic factors to explain why these two trends have happened? Okay, have a go on some paper, pause me and come back. Okay, so have you got an explanation? I hope it is something a bit like this. Well, the starfish was a predator, but actually it preferred or ate more. For what reason? Maybe they were easier to eat or easier to catch, or I don't know, but the starfish ate more mussels than barnacles. So that would have kept the mussel numbers down, and so would have reduced the interspecific competition between the barnacles and the mussels for food. But then when the scientists removed the starfish, the mussels no longer had a predator eating them, removing them, and so their numbers grew, but because they were a better competitor for the same food source as the barnacles, they outcompeted the barnacles, leaving the barnacles with not enough food to sustain their population. And that is an explanation using our biotic factors. Okay, so that's the kind of question you get. You get some scenario, some data, and then you're applying your biotic factors to explain the changes in abundance or distribution of species. So I'm going to get you now to do both at the same time. I'm going to ask you to think about sand dunes. I don't know if you visited sand dune, whether you've been to one recently, but if you think about Formby and Blackpool, where we've got sandy shores, they're sand dunes. Okay, so one of the things about a sand dune is they do change dramatically as you walk inland from the shoreline in terms of their biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, so if you have a little look at the picture, okay, we're going to have a look at both types. But if you think about the biotic factors across the sand dune, if you think about walking inland from the sand there, what's happening to the number of different types of species, plants that you can see? Now you can see that there's way more different plants and species as you're walking inland. So if you think about the bare sand, if you're adapted to live on the bare sand, you've got very little competition. And so, you might think, oh, it's quite a good place to live. We'll think about the abiotic factors as well in a minute. As you move inland, the biotic factors will change because you've got more and more plant species, for example, so there'll be more competition for light, for mineral ions in the soil, etc. So both biotics and abiotics will change when you go across the sand dune. So I've got one final challenge. Okay, so what you need to do is you need to copy out the picture. You then need to consider each of the abiotic factors on the bottom of the screen, and then you also need to add to that anything you could put about biotic factors too. Okay, so pause me and have a go. If you're not sure, you can do the first couple with me. Okay, so if I were considering how abiotic factors change across this sand dune, and the first one I picked was wind speed, I would be writing that over here I would have a high wind speed on the bare sand because it's less sheltered. Okay, and a lower wind speed on the woodland because it would be more sheltered with the other trees, the other plants, etc. Temperature. On my bare sand side, I would be putting greater fluctuations in temperature and a more stable temperature in the woodland. Okay. Light intensity. High light intensity on the bare sand because there's no shading. And on the woodland, you might start to get a lower light intensity, particularly if it's a mature woodland on the forest floor. Okay. Salt spray would be high salt spray on the bare sand, and obviously very low and getting lower as you go inland, so lower salt spray the further you get from the sea. Okay, height of the land, well, that's a nice trend across the whole of that sand dune because there's an increased height above sea level as the dune builds. So this is a building sand dune system, so the sand's washing up in the estuary and it's building new land and the land is raising up. Organic matter in the soil and soil water content, they're both higher in the woodland where you've got an established soil. And aspect is the sort of, we can look at it as the slope, if you like, or north or south facing. So that would sort of be changing. You'll have maybe a north side and then a south side, a north side and a south side, and then as it levels off you won't have that impact of aspect anymore. Okay, so it's only really where it's lumpy and bumpy on the dunes. Right, so once you've got all of that, a bit of a summary. So what can you say about the bare sand? Well, it's got high light intensity, high salt spray, high wind speed, low organic matter in the soil, low water content in the soil, a fluctuating temperature. It has very harsh abiotic conditions. So this is where the abiotic conditions really predominantly affect what organisms can grow and live there, and that's why there aren't very many specially adapted organisms that live there, because there aren't very many organisms, because there aren't very many that are specially adapted to all those abiotic factors. As we move inland and the abiotics become less harsh, then that's why we see the sort of establishment of a greater range of plant species, and with that comes the animal species, because there'll be a greater number of food sources and niches for them to live in. So if you contrast the Bursan with your woodland, there you've got lower wind speed, more stable temperature, although the light intensity might be lower on the woodland floor if it's a mature forest. You have got mineral ions in the soil, you've got water in the soil, and the height above sea level has gone up. So generally, as you're moving inshore, you're moving from a situation where the abiotics are the predominant factors that affect whether or not a species can survive in that, that population can survive in that ecosystem, that bit of the ecosystem, that habitat, to a scenario in the woodland where abiotics are not really going to be the reasons for the certain distribution of species. So if you are looking at a question and you are looking at distribution on the shore, it's likely to be abiotics that are the main factors, although of course there are some biotic factors taking place as well. When you get to the woodland, biotic factors are going to have more influence on the population sizes, because you've got more species, so you've got more predators, more grazers, more competitors now. So you might want to add some biotics to your diagram. So if you wanted to add some biotics to your diagram now, you might put on this side here that there's more competition because there's more species. You might also say that there would be a greater range of predators and a greater range of herbivores grazing on organisms. So biotics are starting to be more important. Of course, even on the shore, there would be predators, there would be grazers, but not as many. Okay, so this links into diversity as well. So we know that that will mean that there'll be quite a low species richness on the Bursan compared to the woodland, where we'll have a high species richness as we've got a larger number of species. So I'll link into all the topics.